the newsagents.
Они пытались скрыться и двигались в сторону Украины, где по предварительным данным для них с украинской стороны было подготовлено окно для перехода государственной границы.
That's Vladimir Putin saying that the perpetrators of the attack, which left over 100 dead at Crocus City Hall concert venue, were heading, guess where? To Ukraine. That's despite the perpetrators being from Tajikistan, a Central Asian republic with a strong Muslim population, in a crime that has been claimed by ISIS-K.
This was the deadliest attack of terrorism yet in Russia for 20 years, and the worst one by ISIS in Europe. It left 137 dead and 140 wounded. So today we're asking what this means for Putin and his war in Ukraine, and what it might mean for the rest of us in Europe if ISIS-K is reimagined and resurfaced. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And it really is a difficult one for Vladimir Putin to spin. Obviously, when you have total control of state media, it makes it a bit easier. But the Americans had warned Russia an attack was coming. It was imminent. American citizens had been told to avoid concert venues. Vladimir Putin replies, this is all propaganda and nonsense and an attempt by the US to destabilise Russia. Turns out, America had it spot on.
And when we first started hearing about this on Friday night, I have to say I got flashbacks to the Bataclan attack in Paris in 2015. And I was covering that, and it was really a sort of profound moment of terrorism because it was clearly attacking the young, the most vulnerable, people who had sort of gone out for just a great night. I guess it's like the Manchester Arena bombing as well. And as you said, it was a concert in the Crocus Hall in central Moscow. It was an old Russian band called Picnic. And the perpetrators went in, started shooting at point blank range, and then they basically set the concert hall on fire, and many more people died as a result of the flames and the smoke inhalation. And I think to try and understand the gravity of what went on in that hall, you need to step back and say who the perpetrators of this kind of terrorist event have been in the past. And there is nothing that leads anywhere near Ukraine or Ukrainian actions, even since the invasion by Putin over 2 years ago.
And it's also made much more complicated by the fact that this has already been claimed by ISIS-K. You know, how does ISIS-K differ from ISIS? Well, it's that sort of geographical region which is built around sort of Afghanistan, Pakistan, exactly, and those sort of areas. And Tajikistan,
whereas the original one was Syria, northern Iraq. This is coming from a slightly different part of the Middle East or part of Asia.
Of Central Asia. And the perpetrators are Tajiks. They are from Tajikistan, which is just north of Afghanistan. And so they had nothing whatsoever to do with Ukraine. It doesn't follow any pattern of Ukraine's waging of defence and battle since the invasion 2 years ago. But on Russian television, on Saturday night, one of the channels put out a clip of the Ukrainian defence chief saying, "We did it." It was a deep fake. It was a cut together of two separate things generated by AI, we imagine, and yet the journalists, inverted commas, working on that station were happy to put out something that they almost certainly knew was utter 100% bull, because that's what they needed to do.
Yeah, I mean, happy, unhappy, they essentially work for Putin. They work for his regime, as many in the media there have to. And I guess the question we're asking is Russia's war with Ukraine making it more vulnerable to this kind of attack because its eyes are elsewhere? You know, it might be using its security forces on the Ukrainian border as opposed to closer to concert halls in Moscow. Or is this the start of something that we now have to expect to reach further than just Moscow, to reach further than Russia? In other words, if ISIS-K is being reinvented, and let's be honest, we all thought it was gone, right? I mean, you listen to Trump and his biggest, sort of overseas boast is he got rid of ISIS. I guess for many of us, we all thought that side of things had quietened down, had gone. And now I guess we're asking the question of whether it's really back and if we should be looking at Moscow as a special case because of Putin and because of the Ukraine war, or whether Moscow is being seen by ISIS as part of Europe now.
And also there is the question that was raised about Netanyahu after the Hamas terrorist attack in October, which is Netanyahu was meant to be Mr. Security. Yeah. Well, so was Vladimir Putin. Yeah. Vladimir Putin was
FSB,
the person with the FSB, KGB, all the rest of it, the GRU, were the people that would keep Russia safe. That there was such repressive policies in place, no one would dare have the ability, have the audacity to launch an attack like the one that was launched on Friday. And yet it has happened. And that does raise questions among Russians about, hang on, do we start joining up the dots that we've committed all these thousands of troops, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, to the border with Ukraine?
When nothing was happening.
We've seen massive casualty lists. And now we get this in Moscow of all places.
Yeah, and we should say that the Russians, as you might expect, have been fairly swift in their retribution. Russian officials are now talking about reintroducing capital punishment, and the kind of details that are coming out about the way those perpetrators, or the people they think are the perpetrators, have been detained and tortured are pretty horrendous.
I mean, the court appearance this morning, the idea of innocent until proven guilty is clearly not part of the canon of law in Russia. These guys were pushed into court, kind of doubled over. One's in a wheelchair, seemingly unconscious. They've all had the kicked out of them. Well, one apparently is missing an eye.
Yeah,
one is
one's
missing an ear.
had his ear taken off and fed to him. So, I mean, I don't know about the kicked out of him, but there's an ear digesting at the moment.
It is the state showing brutality of what the state can do and what it will do to anybody. Let this be a lesson to others who may be thinking of launching their own attack on the Russian motherland.
But I also think the thing that we have to be aware of is how Putin uses propaganda so swiftly and so cleverly to his advantage. And it may seem obvious to all of us sitting here that it is very unlikely to be Ukraine. Zelensky obviously has denied it. It is almost laughable. But if Putin manages to convince those at home, through their newsreaders, through their media channels, through his propaganda, that this is Ukraine, then suddenly he's turned another corner in, Putin land, this narrative of fighting for sovereignty and this is why we're at war. And does this then solidify support, from, let's call them, the Russian mothers behind him? Well, joining us now is Peter Frankopan, Professor of Global History at Oxford. Were you surprised to see ISIS, or whatever this new ISIS is, back in this form in Moscow?
Not really. This form of ISIS, ISIS-K or ISIS Khorasan province, lots of different ways of putting a label on it, formed in about 2014, and they've been quite active about targeting Russia and Russians, and in 2014 blew up a queue outside the Russian embassy in Kabul of people queuing for visas. So the chatter amongst ISIS-K about Russia has been front and central for quite a long time, but that's very different to capabilities, and actually carrying out a major attack like this is a different scale of ability.
Because presumably this would have taken some planning.
Yeah, and there was what happened on all the Telegram channels, which is why the Americans gave a warning about it in advance, was that there was obviously something building up, and it's quite difficult to work out where and when and how, but the noise around a major terrorist attack in a public venue, you take a pick of shopping malls, concert venues, the stuff that the US were mentioning, but then to be able to get through into central Moscow carrying semi-automatic weapons and smoke bombs and other kinds of kit requires quite a lot of coordination, logistics, and a lot of determination. And you've got to evade Russian surveillance. Russia is a pretty well monitored state, as you both know, and so to sneak past that shows a level of competence as well.
And just another kind of idiot question, if I may, because I'm sure a lot of people thinking, well, hang on, why is Russia being targeted. Russia didn't invade Iraq. Russia hasn't supported, Israel in the Middle East. The reasons that have often been given for terrorist attacks by ISIS or Al Qaeda on the West.
Well, ISIS brought down a Russian passenger jet in about 8 years ago, coming back from Sharm el Sheikh to St. Petersburg, and so I guess there are multiple different reasons. One is that the Russian project under Putin is quite closely aligned to a vision of Russia that is exclusive. It's very it's very white, it's very Christian, it's very closely connected to the Russian Orthodox Church, and that doesn't give a great deal of space for minorities. And those minorities have been the ones who've been called up in droves to come and fight on the front lines in the most precarious and dangerous positions. So treatment as a minority in Russia is a brewing problem and has been for a while. You're right, the visibility of Russia in Iraq wasn't as big, but they've been busy in targeting ISIS and Daesh in Syria, so that's important. Russia's close axis with Tehran has been a big part of the last 2 or 3 years, the geopolitical reconfiguration, and the Iranian Shia regime plays very badly particularly with ISIS-K, whose name in fact has a reference to Iranian territory. And then there's also Russian and Wagner Group in large swathes of West Africa, where they're quite involved in some of the anti-ISIS planning there, or anti-Al-Qaeda planning there. So there are a whole bunch of reasons why Russia sits front and central, and Russia gets described in ISIS-K propaganda, which they very usefully produce in a newsletter on a regular basis, as a crusading power. So we don't see them like that from here in the West, but from a Central Asian, from a West Asian point of view, from an Islamic point of view, Russia is no friend to Islam, and in fact is pushing against some of the things that minority rights, better recognitions, etc., that play quite handily to someone who wants high visibility attack like this. Another thing is that Putin and Russia has been quite close to working with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the Taliban are a sworn enemy of ISIS-K, and ISIS-K needs to do these kinds of attacks to recruit more people, to get more power, get more visibility. So it's a big rallying call. And one of the reasons that the chatter has gone on is also about how Moscow has got closer and closer to the regime in Kabul, which of course is the one network in the world that we in the West are more or less detached from. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why an organisation like this would want to target Russia to make it look like it's pushing back at some of those problems.
And just on that, pick up on one point there. So this is a one-off that we've seen in Moscow. This is ISIS-K, their job advert.
It's their campaign video.
Yeah. Well, all terrorist organisations exist on being able to attract more funding, being able to attract boots on the ground, and to be able to deliver results. And so the jubilation across the Telegram channels has been immense in the last couple of days, because to bloody the nose of a nuclear power in the capital city, and the 4 guys who've been tortured and now on trial, I mean, there's a small price to pay, but the magnification effect is very, very large. And breaking down some of those recruitment patterns has been something that the West has worked quite hard on in the last 20 years for obvious reasons. But in our world of increased connectivities, encrypted end-to-end communication channels, cryptocurrencies, moving ideas, people and goods around, weapons around, has never ever been easier. And that, I'm afraid, is a product of the 21st century world that we live in, that we don't spend enough time thinking about.
So, Pete, how does this play into the Ukraine war then? Do you think Putin had his eye off the ball, like security-wise, which made it easier for them to come in? Or do you think that they kind of, realised that Ukraine was going to get blamed for this, whatever happened? And I guess the wider question to that is, does it now make us more vulnerable? I mean, do you think about the Paris Olympics? Do you think about, the Euros? Do you think about all the stuff that's going on in Europe, in the West, in the coming months, because they seem to be sort of reinvigorated and new formed?
Well, there are 2 separate questions there. One is about heightened levels of terror attacks, and for sure this is the largest moment and the most significant moment of radicalisation across Western Europe and the West since 2003, because of what's happened in Israel and Gaza. So no question the heightened visibility and concerns about what might come towards us with these kinds of attacks. I think there's no particular secret that there have been some major events that have been stop from happening in Europe. And, it doesn't take much to slip through the net. That's the problem. So for sure, our levels of anxiety here should be heightened as a result. As far as Russia and Ukraine go, I mean, Putin had an election, for what it's worth, in name anyway, last week, where he scored a magnificent 88% if you are one of his many supporters. Doesn't look to me that there's any particular need to blame Ukraine to strengthen control over the state or to have higher levels of control. I mean, the one thing I suppose is to be able to justify a full mobilization or a wider mobilization. But Putin needs to be able to blame someone quickly so that he looks like he's in control. And that's a different question and a real problem at the moment.
And how easy is that, given that these guys are from Tajikistan, a Central Asian republic, a very long way away from Ukraine? The attack has been claimed by ISIS-K. Video has been produced of them doing the attack in the name of ISIS-K. It's a pretty big sell, isn't it, to the Russian people to convince them that this was the Ukrainians up to no good?
Well, I think, unlike the news agents, if you control state media, it's amazing what you can do to convince people you're doing the right thing. And the levels of support for Putin about the war in Russia are extremely high. And in fact, the real anxieties were last summer when there was a real concern that the Ukrainians might make a breakthrough. I think at the moment, lots of Russians feel that the wind is in their sails and things are going quite well in Ukraine. And the kind of concerns about munitions production and support from the West has felt like Russia's in the ascendancy. So I don't think that there's anything particular to gain, but you need a narrative. And Putin in the short term needs to blame publicly and is blaming Ukraine publicly because that's the easiest thing to do rather than the much more obvious problems that are going to be concerning him and the leadership around him, which is how can the FSB have missed this? How can the response have been on the ground so bad and so slow? What else is coming? Putin, unfortunately, last week decided to both reject and mock the American warning that this was going to happen. So Putin is blaming Ukraine because it's the quickest and easiest way to look like he's got a head on a plate. But underneath it, I think they've got to be really serious questions. And that's where I think the most interesting part of what happens now in Russia is going to be that the group around Putin, apart from the fact they're all ex-KGB guys who grew up with him, they're all late 60s and early 70s like Putin. All the people who are at the head of the Ministry of Defence, of course, Lavrov in Foreign Affairs, Bortnikov, who's been in charge of the FSB for more than 15 years, Patrushev, who's kind of a great eminent cardinal, grey cardinal in the background. They're all old. And so younger people, I think, recognise that this is a war that's being fought by interests that suit that generation and suit the political will of that generation. Now the question is, how does Putin explain that the Russia he sits on top of is perhaps incompetent as well as unfree? And that might be tricky for Putin to work out which pieces of the pack to shuffle away that he can get rid of easily and blame. And that blame game, even if it's not going to happen in public, which it won't do, is going to need to have a full belt and braces review through the sort of the corridors of the Lubyanka and elsewhere to see how this can be stopped. And Russia looks very weak to me at the moment.
So Russia, as in Putin, looks weak. Does he look vulnerable? L'état
c'est moi. That Putin and Russia, they do allied. If Putin moves out of position or slips in the shower or decides it's time to retreat to his villa in Sochi, then the competition for who takes over and what that Russia looks like will change very substantially. And so, no, I think that I don't think it's a pack of cards that comes tumbling down, but I think we're trying to spend a lot of time thinking about where those significant pieces that hold up Putin and hold up the Putin regime will now move. All the people who've left Russia in the last couple of years have degrees. So many people are young. So the Russia that's left behind is quite sclerotic. It looks and reminds me of what the Soviet Union looked like in the 1980s. Lots of grey-haired men who it was obvious made bad decisions, made them slowly, and looked like they were incompetent. And Putin didn't pop up on the airways for almost 24 hours. So that pressure to look like you're doing something is one question, and throwing more men at Ukraine is not an answer, and everyone knows that inside Russia.
Can I just ask one thing that's been kind of on my mind? This whole idea of warning. Would America warn anyone if it had intelligence? I mean, is there a difference between warning a country that's an ally and warning a country that's an enemy? Or do they just go, they're young people and they're concert goers? Would they warn Iran? Would they warn China if they knew about this stuff?
Yeah, I think that there is a convention in that world where state on state, it's a slightly different story. But I think that they're finding state supporters of ISIS and ISIS-K are not easy to find. So warning at that level, it depends how you do it. But I think you can indicate that you're picking up traffic. And you shouldn't have to do that because
They should be
well-organised
doing
states
it.
should be doing it themselves. And,
Yeah.
and that's a real question and a challenge for Russians about how they missed ISIS-K or undervalued or underestimated it.
And do you think that was about the Ukraine war? I mean, do you think they just took their eye off the ball?
Well, I think when you're dedicating a lot of your resource towards the West and towards the stuff that you've been talking about last week as well, about how do democracies go through transitions where we've got all the pieces up in the air in the United States, in Europe too, with this big election year and interference. There's a lot of reports about China and its role in democracies too. That's where all your sort of the power of the Death Star is all pointing in that direction. So your resources are lower, your commitment to listen to reports that come up from your field officers are diminished, and that means that those windows do open up for terrible attacks like this to happen. And they are hugely embarrassing for any state, but they're particularly embarrassing for a state that prides itself on a pretty closed society, on control of all the airwaves, and on looking through what is going on in parts of the world that they should be paying attention to.
Peter, absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure, thank you.
Well, we don't often do breaking news on the newsagents, but news has just broken that Scott Benton, disgraced Conservative MP, who was found to have breached lobbying rules and was facing a long suspension and possibly a recall motion, has jumped before he's going to be pushed. And he has announced that he's standing down from Parliament and is forcing a by-election, which Rishi Sunak needs right now like a hole in the head. Because, let's face it, the last few by-elections haven't gone so great for Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, interestingly, he hasn't updated his own Twitter feed right now, but we know that he is standing down because he was facing essentially a recall petition, which would have probably seen him have to go anyway. And he has now put Rishi Sunak in the position just before we come up to these local elections, May elections, London mayoral elections and other mayoral elections, of exposing Rishi's potential weakness in a part of the world that was very much in the Red Wall under Boris Johnson, but may easily be taken by Labour at the next election.
Well, look, it's a little known part of the constitution of the newsagents that you're not actually technically allowed to discuss a by-election without Lewis Goodall in the studio.
It's true.
So it's only
You
fair.
say it 3 times, I just appear.
Yeah, and he has appeared.
Here I am. Yeah. Yes, another one.
Another one.
Listen, I think the easily now has broken the record for the most by-elections in a single parliament in the post-war period. And they say it's all bad news. Honestly. Well, thanks to that little bit of legislation, which is the David Cameron recall petition, of course. And now, as Emily was saying, Benson has decided to go before he's pushed. And we should just remind ourselves, like, this was a pretty egregious case.
It was open and shut, wasn't it?
It was open and shut. So the House of Commons Committee on Standards found the MP, this is following an investigation from the Times, had given the impression he was, quote, corrupt and, quote, for sale, after he was secretly filmed saying he could table parliamentary questions and provide behind-the-scenes information for up to £4,000 a month. And he was prepared to leak market-sensitive information to an investment fund and ask parliamentary questions on its behalf, which, needless to say, is in breach of parliamentary lobbying rules. And
I
it's
feel
amazing,
sure-
isn't it? God, those rules, they seem a bit harsh, don't they?
I feel sure he's been misunderstood.
I'm
I
sure.
think it's very unfair.
Yeah, indeed. So, as you've already alluded to, John, I mean, actually, by comparison to the kind of enormous majorities that Labour and Lib Dems have been overturning in this Parliament in very, very safe Conservative seats, this is, I mean, even in modestly good political conditions for Keir Starmer, a 3,600 or so majority in Blackpool South should be an absolute easy pickup for Starmer. One interesting dynamic, I'm sure, will be this is on paper the sort of seat where if reform are actually doing as well as the polls would suggest, and who knows, we might in the next couple of weeks in the run-up to the by-election even see a crossover poll, then all eyes will be on them as to try and see if they can manifest or make realise some of those polling numbers in a seat like this, which is a very deprived seat. It's very politically kind of cut off in all sorts of different ways. It's a sort of seat which, heavily Brexit backing. It's a sort of seat which on paper, as I say, reform should do well in.
I underplayed Scott Benton, actually. He hasn't written on his Twitter feed, but he has put a statement on his website saying, "It's with a heavy heart that I've written the Chancellor this morning to tender my resignation as your MP." And there is some question over the date. It could actually fall on May the 2nd. I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? If you wanted to have a by-election that nobody really noticed, you just smuggle it in there.
Exactly. And I wonder whether that would actually make it more difficult for reform if it is on the same day as the local council elections to get the attention and momentum going if they're trying to sort of stand candidates in a number of council seats as well, or whether they put all their eggs in one basket and just say we're going to fight Blackpool South.
I don't know how many council seats Reform are standing for. Is that a big?
Yeah, they are putting candidates up. Obviously, it won't be anything near.
I mean, will we see a lot of Reform councillors at the end of this?
I don't think so. No, I just don't think they have the.
UKIP famously took one council in Cambridgeshire. No, it was a very odd place where UKIP.
They had a few in the end. They had Thanet, they had Thurrock, but not many. I mean, very few.
Yeah,
very, very few. I mean, this is the problem. For local government, parties like UKIP Reform, it's just so hard, as you say, Emily, without with first past the post, but also without the kind of sort of rallying cry of a by-election sort of put down roots. It's really, really difficult. But everyone will be watching it, nonetheless, whether it's in May or later, and everyone will be looking to see how Reform do. And inevitably, this by-election will now come sooner than it would have done before if the by-election recall process had been allowed to play.
And I think it's fair to say people are watching this space right now to see what Scott Benton does next.
Well,
rumours are going around.
We'll try and bring you them. Any update on tomorrow's episode? Watch this space. Side eyes emoji.
Exactly.
But what a loss to Parliament. Scott Benton, farewell.
R.I.P.
So things were looking quite hairy for Donald Trump at the end of last week because he had to pay this bond, which we talked about, £454 million, after his civil fraud case basically landed that at his feet as a debt. He went to around 30 different companies looking to try and find people who would loan him, bridge him that money, and none were forthcoming. And at the 11th hour, pretty much, he managed to get the bond reduced by 3/4, which might not be the sort of thing you find down the back of the radiator, but if you're Trump, you're feeling a little bit happier than you probably were on Friday.
Yeah, and he's still got one difficult bit ahead of him, which is the timing of this trial for the hush money that was paid to Stormy Daniels, that $130,000 that was paid to her, the film star, porn actress who alleged she had an affair with Donald Trump.
But there was a quiet victory over this weekend, which we know you won't want to miss. Donald Trump's own words.
This is from Donald Trump's Truth Social account. It is my great honour to be at Trump International Golf Club in West Palm Beach tonight, awards night, to receive the Club Championship Trophy and the Senior Club Championship Trophy. I won both! Block capitals.
Yeah, it was a large and golfing talented membership. A large and golfing, I'm just reading that, great. A large and golfing talented membership, a great and difficult course made the play very exciting. Qualifying and match play was amazing. A large and distinguished group will be there tonight. Very exciting, thank you, with 3 exclamation marks. So Donald Trump sounds like a 5-year-old who has just won the egg and spoon race at his own golf course. And Joe Biden has come in on top and said, congratulations, Donald. Quite the accomplishment. It's just subtle enough to stick the knife in.
Yeah, it's just, where have we got to in politics? The current president is trolling the former president, because that is what that is. But there's just one other thing to say about Donald Trump on a golf course. That at Bedminster, which is his golf course in New Jersey, the caddies there nicknamed him Pele. Pele, why? Because the golf ball would go into the rough and Donald Trump would just kick the ball out, put it onto the fairway and play his next shot. So, Pele, well done, Donald.
There's one more thing we should say about Truth Social, actually, which is that if Donald Trump wants to find a whole heap of cash very quickly, then he can IPO that. He can make Truth Social his own media platform public, and he would secure, we think, around $3 billion from that. I don't know how much of that is inflated by him, but we think it would yield him $3 billion. He does not have instant access to that at the moment. It's all locked up. But if we start seeing rumblings with Truth Social in the next 24 hours, because it could all happen pretty quickly, then I think we have to understand something about the state of Trump's desperation with that bond that he owes the New York Attorney General. And we'll be back with the conclusion of where that ends up tonight on the US show tomorrow. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.